Why are there so many different approaches to reopening U.S. states? Our co-host Steve was curious about this, so he asked Donald Kettle, who's the Sid Richardson professor at the LBJ School at the University of Texas in Austin.
What has this crisis shown about the relations between the states and the federal government in a time of crisis?
What we've really discovered is that increasingly the kind of government that Americans get depends on where they live. It turns out that the states that decided to lock down their economies in March were far more likely to have decided to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, which meant they were more aggressive in moving toward expansion of health care benefits. States that decided not to lock down were much less likely. So what we've got is an ongoing stream of decisions that the states have been making that yet again have separated themselves in the way in which they responded to this crisis.
Are those differences necessarily bad, because it is a very big country with a lot of different regions to it?
A single clumsy set of decisions from Washington would certainly not have fit the way in which the virus is broken out or the kind of response that we need. So we clearly need a lot of variation. But the problem here has been that there's been a difficulty in trying to get consistent messaging from Washington. And that's led to different responses in different states in ways that don't necessarily match the pattern of the disease. Yes, we need substantial variation among the states, but the variation ought to be based on differences in facts and differences in treatments that are effective. But instead, it's tended to break down much more on partisan lines. And that's really created some serious problems in the way in which the country has responded.
Defenders of federalism will sometimes say that the states are 50 different laboratories for approaching problems in different ways. Could some of that be true now as the country starts to reopen? We get to find out if South Carolina can establish a way to reopen stores without a massive increase in cases. We get to find out if Georgia can reopen tattoo parlors in some safe manner, and the rest of us can watch from a distance while trying a different approach.
The problem is that we're proceeding without much information, and we don't even have a consistent idea about what a test ought to look like, who it ought to be given to, how to measure the results, and how to compare them. And so that's the great problem of trying to run 50 different experiments across the country when we can't agree on what the common ground is for figuring out whether or not those experiments work.
The subtitle of your book, The Divided States of America, is Why Federalism Doesn't Work. Has this experience proved your subtitle correct?
Yeah, I'm afraid it has. And on the one hand, I'm a huge fan of federalism, and I think that there's tremendous advantage in having different states experiment with different kinds of ideas on everything from healthcare to environmental policy. But the underlying problem is the one that Madison and Hamilton and others were battling about back in the 1700s, which was just how much national authority do we need? Hamilton at the time was warning that at some point there would be some things that really required national action and required a strong enough national government to be able to steer our way through. And my great fear is that we are going to prove that this coronavirus problem, that Hamilton was right. That's the grand experiment in many ways that's going on, and it gets to the fundamental question about just how much difference in this country are we willing to tolerate, and what kind of risks are we willing to subject our citizens to at the cost of allowing states to experiment and go in such different directions.
Donald F. Kettle is at the University of Texas at Austin and is the author of The Divided States of America. Thanks so much.
So good to be with you.
The state of Georgia, like so many other parts of the country, is urging its residents to vote by mail this election year, with regular voting upended by the coronavirus. But during the last presidential election, only about 5% of the state's votes were cast by absentee ballot, so there's a lot to do to prepare for Election Day. Emil Moffitt from member station WABE has more.
Voting by mail isn't anything new in Georgia, but that doesn't mean it's been a popular choice until this year, when the coronavirus outbreak led to social distancing guidelines and 2 delays in the state's presidential primary, which is now set for June 9th.
I've been in the department for 18 years and I've never seen anything like this before.
That's Pam Coleman, registration manager with Fulton, the state's largest county.
We have an overwhelming amount of applications coming in.
That's due in part to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, who made the decision to mail absentee ballot applications to anyone who's voted in a recent election.
Obviously, we're taking this unprecedented step with the absentee ballot situation and that outreach to voters. But we know that typically over 95% of all Georgia voters like to vote in person.
While the state sent out applications to millions of voters, it won't cover the cost of postage to return those applications or completed ballots. And this sudden shift to mail-in voting has put a squeeze on county elections officials. So far, more than 1 million applications for absentee ballots have been submitted across the state. Fulton County Elections Director Richard Barron says he had to enlist employees from the county's tax office to handle the surge.
We have about 30 individuals, and everyone's spread out through the atrium at the government center.
Once those applications are approved by the county, a list is uploaded to the state. Georgia recently signed a contract with the company to print and mail those absentee ballots. But lots of other states are seeing a surge in absentee ballot requests too. Amber McReynolds is with the advocacy group Vote at Home. She says this demand could strain companies that print ballots.
The biggest issue really is timing. They have a lot of capacity, but they need to be able to plan, order paper, order envelopes, and make sure those things happen sufficiently.
Georgia elections officials maintain this push toward vote by mail is temporary, but McReynolds asks what happens come November if things haven't changed.
They spent millions of dollars sending mailing that won't actually be good for voters for the general election, which is kind of silly.
By law in Georgia, only seniors, those with disabilities, and members of the military can be put on a permanent list to automatically get an absentee ballot for every election. A bill that will change that to apply to all Georgia voters was introduced earlier this year, but that was before the state legislative session was suspended because of the coronavirus. For NPR News, I'm Emil Moffat in Atlanta.
Hey parents, Mindy here from Wow in the World, NPR's podcast for all ages. With schools out, we are all looking for fun ways to educate and entertain.
With the start of a new month, it's a good time to take a step back and take stock of this pandemic. The U.S. spent April more or less in lockdown. During that time, the number of infections and deaths from COVID-19 continued to grow, while many governors and President Trump said it's time to start reopening the economy. Jeremy Konyndyk is a public health expert with the Center for Global Development. He worked on international disaster response in the Obama administration, and he joins us now to talk about where the U.S. stands compared to a month ago. Good to have you back on the program.
Thank you. Good to be here.
You argued on Twitter that the U.S. has basically been treading water for the last month, and I'd like you to walk us through the numbers that you based that conclusion on. Let's start with how many cases there are in the U.S. today compared with the start of April. What do you see?
Well, we've been basically on a plateau. So in the first day of April, we had about 25,000 cases. And on the last day of April, we had around 29,000 cases. And through the entire month, we've kind of fluctuated within that basic range, kind of never getting too far out of the low 30s, but never dipping below the low 20s. And that seems to be where we're continuing now heading into May. That suggests that we have limited transmission at a certain level, but we're not yet driving it down, and that's not a good place to be.
Our understanding of the number of cases is informed by the availability of testing, right? So how are we doing on the number of tests being given? What's the number today compared to a month ago and compared to where we ought to be?
Well, so in the first week of March, the U.S. was averaging about 144,000 tests per day, and by the end of the month, that had gone up about 50% to 220,000 tests per day.
You said the first day of March. Did you mean the first of April?
A month ago?
Okay.
Yes, the first week of April.
So it's about doubled in the last month.
It's gone up about 50% over the course of April, in terms of the average, and that's progress. But where we need to be to even really think about beginning to open and reopen some parts of the economy is at least 500,000 tests per day, and probably several million.
Okay, and then let's talk about deaths. I mean, in the U.S., this disease has now killed more people than the entire American death toll of the Vietnam War. Where is that trend line today?
Well, deaths tend to lag cases. Usually by the time someone shows up in the official case count, they are ending up in an emergency room, and it's a few more weeks then before they either are discharged or they pass away. So I think we can expect that wherever cases are today, that's indicative of where deaths are going to be in a few more weeks. So as long as we stay on this plateau of cases, we'll stay on a plateau of deaths as well.
So help us understand why this is. The U.S. economy has been almost entirely shut down for more than a month. Why hasn't that been enough to stop this disease from spreading and put the trend lines in a steep downward direction?
Well, because I think if you compare the U.S. to other countries that have been going through the same thing, the countries that have really bent the curve downward, not just held it flat, but bent it downward, have had lockdowns that typically are more stringent than we've seen in the United States. And they have also not relied solely on lockdowns. They've also done much more extensive testing and contact tracing and those kind of targeted public health measures in addition to the lockdown. We haven't really done that in a consistent way in this country, and we're only just beginning to start that in some states.
And some states are now starting to open up again. Businesses are accepting customers again. That being the case, what do you expect to see happen in May?
I'm very nervous about what happens in May. We don't yet have. So what you want to have is you want to have a different way to control cases than just reliance on lockdowns. And you have to build that because we don't have a strong public health infrastructure in this country that could achieve that. We need to be able to do the kind of contact tracing that China did, that South Korea did, that Singapore is doing. And South Korea should be the model. They built their model on wide-scale testing, wide-scale tracing, and we're not going to deliver that through the states alone. The federal government has to step up and play a much more aggressive role than we've seen so far.
And so, just in our last 30 seconds, do you expect the trend lines for the month of May are going to continue this plateau or go up or down? What are you looking for?
I think it really depends on the choices we make. If we reopen prematurely, as a number of states seem to be considering, then I would expect the cases and deaths will go back up. If we just continue what we're doing, we can probably hold them steady but not improve. So we need to do something else. We need to build that big investment in public health capacity and tools.
That's Jeremy Konyndyk from the Center for Global Development. Thanks for your time today.
My pleasure.
A staple of the suburban mall filed for bankruptcy today. J.Crew could be first among several retailers to implode during the coronavirus pandemic from financial troubles that predate the health crisis. NPR's Alina Selyuk reports.
The history of J.Crew goes back over 70 years as a catalog company whose sport-inspired name was a direct response to Ralph Lauren's polo with the initial J to look cool. But there's a moment in recent memory when, by all measures, the brand hit the big time.
This is a J.Crew ensemble.
Really? Wow.
Michelle Obama, about to become fashion trendsetter First Lady, touting J.Crew's sensible pricing on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno.
I have no idea what that means, but okay.
Yeah. We ladies, we know J.Crew.
That was late 2008, a sort of a renaissance for the preppy brand with its striped silhouettes, nautical stripes, cashmere sweaters, and crew neck cardigans. But this week, the company became the first retail casualty during the coronavirus pandemic, which has left stores and malls around the country shut for weeks. Clothing brands are especially struggling, which is particularly painful for those already in financial distress, like JCPenney, Brooks Brothers, Neiman Marcus, or J.Crew.
This accelerated the inevitable.
Sucharita Kodali is a retail analyst at Forrester. She says J.Crew has been skating on the edge of bankruptcy for a while. The company's story is a familiar one in retail. Private equity firms bought J.Crew about a decade ago and weighted down with debt. Soon after, the brand began to miss trends and slowly lose cachet in a growing crowd of online competitors.
You think that you have the ability to set trends, and you think that anything that you create, people will buy.
That worked for J.Crew for a while. For those epic years of success, J.Crew was run by a man known as the Merchant Prince, Mickey Drexler. Alongside him was influential fashion designer Jenna Lyons, who took mass-market J.Crew to the New York Fashion Week.
If you're already familiar with J.Crew, you know that we like to pair sparkle with tweed.
But then came complaints that J.Crew was becoming too runway, too expensive. The company became a revolving door of executives. It totally missed the huge athleisure trend. Its online business wasn't keeping up.
It was selling a lot of the same types of merchandise, the ballet slippers and the bejeweled sweaters, and the big chunky necklaces, which are cute, but they were a little off trend by, the last few years.
J.Crew's shining star was Madewell, the more youthful and casual brand. The company wanted to spin it off and use that cash to pay down some of the debt. But that public listing was suspended in March, right as the pandemic hit. Now, J.Crew hopes to reopen its stores soon as it gets its finances in order using bankruptcy, an option on the table for a growing list of big retailers during the coronavirus crisis. Alina Selyuk, NPR News.
As if the pandemic and the economic meltdown aren't bad enough, now the New York Times informs us that murder hornets have arrived in the Pacific Northwest. Officially, the insect is called the Asian giant hornet. They can grow 2 inches long, and they have a habit of decapitating entire colonies of honeybees. They can also cause a lot of pain to humans. Beekeepers and entomologists are racing to find and wipe out any nests in the U.S. before the species can take hold.